Hey guys, what is up? Happy New Year. Welcome back. Or if you're new here, hi. Thank you so much for clicking on this video. I'm so happy that you're here. My name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime or creepy history topics each week. Last week, we talked about Sean Hornbeck and Ben Ownby, a story that was very different for the channel because although those boys were put through absolute hell and back, their story actually had a happy ending, which is a rarity around here. So if you're interested in checking out that video, I will make sure to have it linked up here in the card for you. Feel free to head over there when you're done here. And if you're just interested in true crime or the macabre in general, and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. Whew, you guys, today's story, it's a real mixed up, mashed up whirlwind of a clusterfuck. There's so many people involved to the point where I don't even know who to name this video after. I mean, this shit is a mess. So, get psyched? Linda Marie Bailey was born on August 26, 1961 in North Platte, Nebraska. However, she grew up in the Inland Empire region of Southern California, just east of Los Angeles. She was raised by a single mother alongside her 10 siblings, which is a lot of kids for one person to support. So needless to say, she and her family struggled quite a bit financially. They lived in a rundown old trailer with hardly enough money to make ends meet, let alone to splurge on any luxuries. But when Linda was 13, everything about her life changed when she met a man named David Arnold Brown. David lived just 2 doors down from Linda, and she was immediately attracted to him. He was older than she was, in his mid-20s when they met, and he was already a fairly successful businessman. He'd earned his success early on by developing a special computer program to help recover lost data from computer hard drives. It caught on pretty quickly throughout the tech world, which in turn earned him a steady 6-figure income. Now, it's not uncommon for young girls to find older boys and men attractive, but disgustingly, David was just as taken with Linda as she was with him, despite the fact that she was a literal child. The two almost immediately began dating, and I think I can safely speak for all of us when I say bleh. Linda and David dated for 4 years before they went on to get married in 1979 in Las Vegas when Linda was just 17. Mind you, David was 27 at the time, he'd been married 4 times already, and he had an 8-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. But Linda didn't care. She loved him and she wanted to be with him no matter what. Following their nuptials, the honeymooners moved from Inland Empire to Orange County, which was a huge socioeconomic jump for Linda. She'd been poor all her life, but now, in the blink of an eye, she was living beyond comfortably. David was making way more money than the two of them alone needed to get by. A cushion that came in handy when, shortly into their marriage, Linda was contacted by her 11-year-old sister Patty, who was reaching out for help out of the dysfunctional dynamic she was caught in at home. Linda knew all too well what Patty was going through and wanted desperately to help her little sister. She figured maybe she could step in and help provide her with the life that she felt she deserved. So, under the condition that it was okay with David, she offered to let her sister move into their home with them. When Linda approached David with the idea, he eagerly gave his blessing. He thought Patty moving in with them was a great idea. So, armed with her husband's permission, Linda gave her sister the go-ahead, and the next thing they knew, Patty showed up on their doorstep, bags in hand, ready and eager to move in. And she was welcome with more than open arms. David and Linda had even gone out of their way to decorate a teenage dream room for her. A room that they then filled with clothes and books and trinkets and knickknacks. Basically anything a preteen girl in the late 70s, early 80s could possibly dream of. Patty was in heaven. For as long as she could remember, she'd been barely scraping by. In her wildest dreams, she could not have imagined a life like the one that she'd seemed to have stumbled into. Linda and David very quickly became the parents she'd always wanted. However, it wasn't until a few years later that Linda and David actually became parents to their own child. In 1984, the couple welcomed a beautiful, healthy little daughter whom they named Crystal. Linda felt like her life and her marriage were perfect. But sadly, things are not always as they appear, and unbeknownst to Linda, her marriage had a massive flaw. Her husband, David, whom she idolized so deeply, was having an affair. An affair that was not only happening right under her nose, but under her very own roof. Yes, despite the fact that she was only 11 when she'd moved into their home, David began pursuing a relationship with Patty almost immediately. He started by working her emotionally, using words to make her feel special and wanted. And as she fell deeper and deeper for his manipulation, he began to cross more and more boundaries with her physically. And by the time Patty was just 15, she and David were smack dab in the middle of a full-blown affair. They'd get together at least once a week, frequently capitalizing on times that Linda was either napping, showering, or shopping. And this was not just like some regular sloppy old affair. I mean, it was in the sense that Patty was 15 and David was 31, and they lived together with David's wife and David and his wife's baby, and Patty and David's wife were sisters. Oh my God, it was a mess. What I mean is, it wasn't like an emotionless fling. David and Patty frequently discussed having a future together and getting married one day. It was like they were living in some fantasy land where Linda didn't even exist. And as if shit wasn't messy enough, if you can believe it, things were about to get even more complicated. Because in the fall of 1984, David sat Linda and Patty down one night and explained to them that his 14-year-old daughter, Cinnamon, would now also be coming to live with them. Cinnamon and her mother had been having issues for quite some time at this point, which David was completely aware of. So when her mother finally reached her breaking point, David agreed that Cinnamon could come and stay at his place until the tension and issues had kind of resolved. They were like a real-life, mixed-up, mashed-up, semi-incestuous Brady Bunch. But sick, demented, and twisted as we know the arrangement to be, at first it was bearable. Yes, Cinnamon and Patty would sometimes bicker like real sisters, and like in any family, there were sometimes disagreements, but overall, for the next few months, things seemed okay-ish. That is until March 19th, 1985, when Garden Grove police received a frantic 911 call regarding a possible homicide. Police responded immediately to 1255 Ocean Drive, where they found 23-year-old Linda Marie Brown clinging to life in the master bedroom. She was gurgling for air and covered in blood, the result of 2 gunshot wounds she'd sustained to her upper chest. She was rushed by emergency medical personnel to Fountain Valley Community Hospital, but despite their desperate efforts to save her life, she passed away at 4:26 a.m. Police began their investigation into her death immediately, starting as they always do by speaking to the spouse. Police asked David to describe the previous day to them, detailing all of the events leading up to Linda's death. He explained to them that they'd had a fairly normal day, that his parents had come by earlier, and they'd all spent time together playing cards and having dinner. He noted that the only thing out of the ordinary was that Linda had opted to turn in a little early because she hadn't been feeling well. David then claimed that once his parents left and everyone else had gone to bed, he left the home to go for a drive to help with his insomnia. He explained to them that he was shocked when he'd returned home around 2 a.m. to Patty running hysterically out of the house with the baby in her arms. He said he'd asked her repeatedly what was wrong and what had happened, but that she had been way too emotional to give him a straight answer. It was at that point that David decided to call 911. On the call, he explained to the operator that he believed his wife was dead, despite the fact that he just said Patty had not been able to tell him what had happened, and he never made any attempts to go in the bedroom and check on Linda himself. So I don't really know how he managed to jump to that conclusion, but lucky guess, I suppose. And while David provided his version of events to the detective that was questioning him, another detective began trying to question Patty, but she was still way too, over the top emotional. It took a while, but eventually she did finally calm down enough to explain to police what she'd witnessed. According to Patty, after David had left the house to go for his drive, Cinnamon and Linda had gotten into a really heated argument. Over what? We don't know. But as the fight escalated, Patty eventually heard gunshots before she saw Cinnamon run out of the master bedroom with a gun. To which police responded, who the actual fuck is Cinnamon? And where is she now? Because the answer sure ain't anywhere to be found within these 4 walls. But beyond the information she'd already provided, Patty was unable to help them any further. At this point, some of the investigators began collecting preliminary evidence from inside the home. This included testing both Patty and David's hands for gunshot residue, while other officers spread out around the home and began searching the property for Cinnamon, or at the very least, any sign as to where she may have gone. However, as luck would have it, they really didn't have to look too far. They ultimately found Cinnamon in the backyard, passed out in a doghouse. She was completely unconscious, lying in a pool of her own vomit, and clutching a note in her hand that read, quote, "Dear God, please forgive me. I didn't mean to hurt her," unquote. This note, combined with the information provided by Patty, led officers to the conclusion that Cinnamon and Linda must have gotten into a huge fight. A fight that led Cinnamon to shoot and kill her before taking a large, nearly fatal cocktail of pills in an attempt to then take her own life. Because she'd nearly overdosed, she obviously had to be taken for medical treatment before they could formally question her about what had happened that night. It took a few days, but Cinnamon made a full recovery, and as soon as she was coherent enough to answer questions, you better believe police were right there to ask them. However, when finally asked about the events of March 19th, Cinnamon was steadfast in the fact that she could not remember anything. So, because of the evidence they'd collected from the home and the statements they'd obtained from David and Patty, police really had no choice but to arrest Cinnamon for the premeditated murder of Linda Brown. Despite her claims that she had no recollection of what had happened that night, Cinnamon willingly pled guilty to the charges and was subsequently sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. However, because she was just a teenager, rather than being sent to actual prison, she was sent to the California Youth Authority with the expectation that she'd be released when she was about 25. Once Cinnamon was incarcerated and the case was officially closed, David appeared to be having an incredibly difficult time coping with the loss of his wife. And he seemed to be having an even harder time forgiving his daughter for what she'd done. He refused to attend any of her court proceedings, and he just did not seem to have any interest in providing any type of fatherly support to his daughter. Strangely enough, David wasn't the only person who was having a hard time letting go of what happened to Linda. Despite the fact that the case was technically classified as solved and closed, the investigators just couldn't shake a nagging feeling in their gut that there was more to this story. They just were not quite ready to fully move on. Suspicions that were confirmed when the result of Patty and David's gunshot residue tests from the night of Linda's murder finally came back. David had tested negative, as he'd expected he would. However, Patty's test had inexplicably come back as positive. Now investigators knew that they had to keep digging. There was something they were missing, and they were determined to figure it out. For real this time. Did Patty set this whole thing up? Did she shoot Linda and manipulate Cinnamon into taking the blame? Or worse, did she somehow manipulate Cinnamon into actually believing she was responsible? Obviously, they couldn't be sure, but they were definitely starting to believe that Patty could have been the mastermind behind Linda's murder all along. Unfortunately, though, you can't arrest people based off of a hunch, so they had to be patient. All they could do was wait and watch. Observe Patty and slowly collect evidence to attempt to build a new case for what may have actually happened. So they began surveillance on Patty in hopes of getting some answers. And considering Patty was still living with David, they ended up kind of inadvertently watching him as well. And it wasn't long into the surveillance that police made a very interesting discovery. Turned out, David had taken out several life insurance policies on Linda just weeks prior to her death, all of which he had collected following Cinnamon's arrest. Altogether, the policies totaled roughly $835,000, which would be equivalent to about $2.1 million today. Yeah, maybe David ain't so innocent and naive after all. Once he thought he was out from under police microscope, the devastation that David had displayed over the loss of his wife quickly faded, and he and Patty began blowing through Linda's life insurance money at an impressive, albeit slightly alarming, rate. They purchased a lavish home in Anaheim Hills and proceeded to fill it with literally anything and everything they could ever dream of. And on top of this, through their surveillance, it had become very obvious to police that David and Patty were openly romantically involved. A discovery that begged the question, when exactly did this relationship begin? Was it before or after Linda's death? Could Patty have killed her own sister in an effort to take over her life? Or perhaps did the two of them plan Linda's murder together from the start? Basically, they didn't know what the fuck was going on, but they were sure it was not what they'd initially believed. Meanwhile, they've got Cinnamon locked up for Linda's murder, and now they're not even sure if she was involved at all. Now, This may be weird to say, but Cinnamon was actually doing really well in prison. She was described as a model inmate, well-behaved, well-mannered. She didn't cause any trouble. Honestly, it was really hard for the people who were around her every day to even believe she could be responsible for Linda's death. However, still when pressed by police, she would always maintain that she had some form of amnesia and that she simply could not remember anything that had happened the night that Linda was killed. The only thing that seemed different for Cinnamon now versus when she'd first been locked up was the fact that David had slowly started reintegrating himself into her life. He was routinely visiting her or communicating with her by phone, as well as sending her extravagant gifts to the prison. Whatever she could possibly want or need. A TV, a radio. If she was allowed to have it, you can bet he'd send it to her. However, what Cinnamon was unaware of was that these gifts paled in comparison to the lifestyle that David was now providing for Patty. While Cinnamon sat in prison, David had Patty living like an absolute queen, all on the dime of her dead sister. Patty and David even officially got married and had a baby of their own just 2 years after Linda was killed. Yeah, they wasted no time. And again, all of this was completely unbeknownst to Cinnamon. But don't worry, because while we're all sitting here like this, police were still observing Patty and David, and they felt exactly the same way about it. I believe the technical term for what we're all feeling is ooked out. Yeah, that seems to sum it up. But even though Patty and David's relationship was clearly gross and in poor taste, police still didn't have any solid evidence that they'd orchestrated Linda's murder. Cinnamon still wasn't talking, and while it's yucky, it's not illegal for your little sister to shack up with your much older husband 15 minutes after you're murdered, so they were feeling kind of stuck investigation-wise. So they decided to start looking towards the one path that they hadn't really ventured down at this point. David's past. And as they dug further and further back, they realized that this whole thing was kind of a pattern for David. He seemed to almost prey on these pretty young girls from low-income areas that were desperate for a way out. He'd woo them, and then he'd provide for them, and sooner or later they'd become completely and totally dependent on him. I don't know for sure why, but my guess is that it made him feel powerful. Or maybe it's because women his own age could see right through his bullshit from 1,000 miles away. But whatever the reason, it's gross. I do know that much for sure. Nevertheless, police were able to pretty quickly piece together that he'd been doing this for years before Linda had entered the picture. He'd perfected his craft at the expense of multiple poor girls, all the way up through present day with his current conquest, Patty. Somehow, David was able to smooth talk right past his less than charming appearance and his poor health, just enough to get his hooks into these girls. Then he'd keep them totally and completely enamored with him until he decided he was done and ready to move on to the next best thing. Sick, sick, sicko. And the more familiar that police became with David's past, the more they began to believe wholeheartedly that he had to have somehow been involved in Linda's murder. Maybe they'd been looking in the wrong direction this whole time. Maybe he wasn't just involved, maybe he was the actual mastermind, not Patty. At this point, they decided their best chance at filling in the blanks of Linda's murder was to circle back yet again to Cinnamon. Is it even circling back if it's like the 100th time they've talked to her? Feels more like this! You know? But I get it, she was the only person there that night who, if their theory was correct, would have any reason to ever be honest with them. They were actually a little more hopeful now than they'd ever been in her before. She'd been in prison and out from under her father's thumb for going on 4 years now. She was going to school, she was seeing a therapist, she was making friends. Essentially, she was becoming a completely new and different person. And just as police had hoped, this new version of Cinnamon was, how do you say, less than pleased when she learned from the parole board just what Patty and her father had been up to since she'd been in prison. When she finally learned that her father was not only still shacked up with Patty, but that they were married and had a baby, she was pissed. In an instant, everything suddenly became crystal clear to Cinnamon. She finally realized that she had been completely and totally manipulated by her own father and his child bride. The only thing that was more obvious to Cinnamon was what she needed to do next, and she didn't waste any time in doing it. In 1988, Cinnamon finally sat down with detectives and came clean to them about everything. She explained to them that yes, she really had been the one to shoot Linda, but that she had certainly not acted alone. Rather, that her father, David, had been the one who had convinced her that she had to do it. Cinnamon totally and completely spilled her guts that day, finally giving police the information they'd been waiting for years. However, the problem was, it wasn't worth a damn in court. Without any hard evidence, no judge or jury was going to see this as anything other than a self-serving move on Cinnamon's part. A desperate attempt to free herself from prison early. Simply put, her word against her father's was not going to be good enough. They needed something more concrete, and luckily, they had an idea of just how to get it. Their plan was to have Cinnamon reach out to her father and request that he come and visit her. And if they were lucky, having Cinnamon equipped with a wire, maybe at said visit, they could catch some form of a confession from David on tape. And thankfully, although he didn't recount the evening in explicit detail or go over everyone's involvement point by point, he certainly gave up enough information for police to act on. During this conversation, David talked about the mob, and how prior to her death, Linda and her brother had been plotting to kill him. He admitted to mixing up the cocktail of pills for Cinnamon to take before the murder, and he continued to reiterate to her that she could not tell the true story because then all of them would be imprisoned, and due to his various health problems, he wouldn't survive incarceration. Following this sting in September of 1988, David was arrested and held in jail, while Patty was arrested and detained in the youth facility. Oh yes, my friends, the very same youth facility where Cinnamon was also incarcerated. Awkward. Actually, in all seriousness, it was really bad for Patty. Cinnamon had been in that facility for almost 4 years, all of which she'd spent making friends and building relationships, crossing literally no one. And then in comes Patty, her mortal enemy. And as people began to find out Patty's history with Cinnamon, Patty basically became public enemy number one. It seemed like everyone had it out for her. And while I'm sure this was super vindicating for Cinnamon at first, it didn't take long for she and Patty to realize that hating each other was getting them nowhere. They had much bigger fish to fry. So, rather than tear each other apart in prison, which, let's be honest, wasn't beneficial to either of them, they decided they'd be much better off banding together. They agreed to testify against David and to finally, for the first time in years, be honest about what he'd convinced them to do and why. Meanwhile, as his trial approached, David really started to feel the pressure of prison, especially knowing it may be his home for a very, very long time. And this realization quickly turned into desperation. He had to figure out a way to save himself, and fast. So he hatched yet another harebrained, self-serving scheme. He approached a fellow inmate, one he knew was scheduled for release soon, and he propositioned him. He explained that he was super rich and that he could make this man's reintegration into the free world much, much easier if he would just be willing to do him a teeny tiny favor. That favor, you ask? Oh, nothing major. Just murder the prosecutor in charge of his case, the main detectives, and Patty. Yeah, the whole lot of them. Just wipe them out. Simple as that. His thought process here was that if Patty, the prosecutor, and the lead investigator were all out of the picture, then obviously new people would have to be assigned to the case against him. At which point he would insist on his right to a speedy trial, placing them at a massive disadvantage. Just how fucking delusional is this man? Thankfully, despite the fact that the man agreed to the deal to David's face, he had no real intentions of following through with the plan. You see, he had enough wherewithal to know that a quadruple murder wasn't the best way to start off your new life as a free man. So instead, he took it upon himself to contact the authorities, and together, they devised a plan to set David up. Yet again. They had their informant stay in communication with David until he paid him for the hit, which gave them enough evidence to charge him with his attempt on their lives as well. Shoot, he thought he was screwed before? Well, this really backed him into a corner. This made it super easy for the prosecution to argue David's guilt. Why on earth would an innocent defendant need to kill a prosecution witness, the prosecutor, and the lead investigator. It just doesn't make sense. During their testimonies at David's trial, both Cinnamon and Patty got on the stand and detailed exactly how Linda's murder came to be. David had initially presented the idea to the girls by explaining that he'd found out that Linda and her brother were planning to kill him, and that the only way he could think to stop her was to strike first. He easily preyed on their vulnerabilities and insecurities, just as he'd done with countless young girls before them. He convinced them that if Linda managed to kill him first, that the two of them would lose everything. That without him to watch out for them, they'd likely end up on the streets with nothing. He told them that he loved them so much and that the thought of not being there for them made him sick to his stomach. Then he hit them with the famous line of this case. He told them, well, more specifically Cinnamon, that if she truly loved him, she would do exactly as he said. And of course, at first, as it would be for most people, the idea of murder was really jarring to Patty and Cinnamon. But over time, as David worked his magic, he basically brainwashed the girls, and the topic almost became mundane. It was something that they discussed regularly, eventually with little to no extreme emotion. It didn't seem real, more like some far-off fantasy they just enjoyed discussing. That is, until the evening of March 19th, when David told the girls it was go time. By now, he'd managed to successfully convince the girls that he himself couldn't kill Linda because his health was too poor, and if he got caught, he'd never survive prison. But rest assured that they, again, more specifically Cinnamon because she was the youngest, she could do it, and if she got caught because she was so young, it wouldn't be a big deal. At the most, she'd be jailed briefly and forced into some therapy, but that she'd be released, super quick. He then provided her with the gun, forced her to write the note she was found half dead clutching in the doghouse. Then, on top of everything else, this SOB forced his own daughter to swallow a random-ass concoction of pills just to really drive home the idea that Linda's death was part of a murder-suicide. Once all these pieces were in place, Father of the Century took off for his insomnia drive, knowing good and well that when he returned, his wife would be dead, his daughter would be arrested, and he'd be free to ride off into the sunset with his dead wife's insurance money and his new child bride. Just a hot-ass mess. So David leaves feeling pretty proud of himself, and sure enough, while he's gone, Cinnamon did as she was told, and she shot Linda. She shot her once, which wounded her but did not kill her, and when she attempted to shoot her again, the gun jammed. At this point, Cinnamon just completely freaked out. She lost her cool, and she started to scream for Patty's help. So Patty ran in and helped Cinnamon unjam the gun, which explained the gunpowder residue on Patty's hands. And once the gun was functioning again, Cinnamon returned to the master bedroom, where this time she fatally shot Linda. In response to the girls' testimonies, David's defense argued that, they did it. They were guilty, not him. So clever. How long do you think it took him to come up with that one? Once the closing arguments concluded, the jury was excused for deliberation, where they discussed David's fate for just 7 hours before they returned with a verdict. And on June 15th, 1990, David Arnold Brown was found guilty as holy hell and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Because of her age at the time of the crime and her cooperation in the case against David, Patty was sentenced to just 4 years in prison for her role in the murder. She was released by the time she was 25, and she went on to get married and successfully regain custody of the daughter she shared with David. Linda and David's daughter Crystal was ultimately raised by David's mother. And speaking of Crystal, she actually has a YouTube channel where she talks about her perspective and growing up and finding out about all this. So if you're interested, I will make sure to have that linked down below. It's definitely a unique perspective on one of these cases, and in my opinion, it's worth hearing. As for Cinnamon, she was released in 1992 at age 21 after serving about 8 years. She's lived a fairly quiet life ever since, settling down happily and having a family of her own. She never spoke to her father again following his trial, especially once she realized that had she not thrown up the fatal overdose of pills he'd forced her to take, she likely would have died that night as well. And let's face it, daughter or not, I wholeheartedly believe that that was his plan all along. David never accepted any responsibility for Linda's murder, and he most certainly never showed even a speck of remorse for what he'd done or the lives he'd ruined. He was just like a really awful, terrible person. I assume that not too many people were all that torn up when he died in prison in March of 2014. And with his demise, that about wraps up our story for today. I don't know about you guys, and hopefully this isn't like a super controversial take on the whole thing, but I'm happy that Patty and Cinnamon got to move on and live relatively normal lives. I know that what they participated in was horrible, but they were literal babies when it happened. Their brains weren't fully developed at that point in their lives. They could not possibly rationalize the consequences of their actions. It's not like they independently concocted the plan. They weren't criminal masterminds. They were manipulated and brainwashed by the one person they trusted the most. From their perspective, Linda's death was a matter of self-preservation. They believed David was in danger and that without him, their lives would completely fall apart. And because they were children, I completely understand how they were able to believe that so fully. I think that both of their punishments were relatively fitting, and I wholeheartedly believe that they deserve their second chance. But in the same breath, I want to make it very clear that I am so incredibly saddened for Linda. I mean, to never get to see your child grow up is an agonizing thought. And to know that she survived long enough to likely understand what was happening is gut-wrenching. And I feel for her daughter. Listening to her talk on her channel, you can really feel just how much pain she's been through having to grow up and get married and have children without her mother. I don't know, cases like this are just hard. There are so many people who are affected and so many people to feel for. Honestly, if you try and look at it objectively from each person's perspective, your feelings almost start to contradict each other. Does that make sense? Anyways, I'm rambling, so I'm gonna stop here. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Before you head out, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. It only takes a second and it really helps out the channel a lot, so thanks in advance. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime or creepy history content each week, and I'd love to catch you back here in my next video. If you wanna make sure you don't miss my next video, you might as well turn on the post notifications for the channel. I'm a miserable failure when it comes to posting on the same day each week, so having those turned on will help to make sure you're notified as soon as I do upload. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye guys.